"She'll not come here again," said Mr. Owens. "Next time she wakes, it'll be in her own graveyard, wherever it is she's going." Mrs. Owens bent down to the baby and extended her arms. "Come now," she said warmly. "Come to Mama." To the man Jack, walking through the graveyard towards them on a path, his knife already in his hand, it seemed as if a swirl of mist had curled around the child in the moonlight, and that the boy was no longer there. Just damp mist and moonlight and swaying grass. He blinked and sniffed the air. Something had happened, but he had no idea what it was. He growled in the back of his throat like a beast of prey, angry and frustrated. "Hello," called the man Jack, wondering if perhaps the child had stepped behind something. His voice was dark and rough, and there was an odd edge to it, as if of surprise or puzzlement at hearing itself speak. The graveyard kept its secrets. "Hello," he called again. He hoped to hear a baby cry or utter a half-word or to hear it move. He did not expect what he actually heard. A voice, silky smooth, saying, "Can I help you?" The man Jack was tall. This man was taller. The man Jack wore dark clothes. This man's clothes were darker. People who noticed the man Jack when he was about his business, and he did not like to be noticed, were troubled or made uncomfortable or found themselves unaccountably scared. The man Jack looked up at the stranger, and it was the man Jack who was troubled. "I was looking for someone," said the man Jack, slipping his right hand back into his coat pocket so the knife was hidden, but there if he needed it. "In a locked graveyard, at night," said the stranger. "It was just a baby," said the man Jack. "I was just passing when I heard a baby cry, and I looked through the gates and I saw him. Well, what would anyone do?" "I applaud your public-spiritedness," said the stranger. "Yet if you managed to find this child, how are you planning to get out of here with it? You can't climb back over the wall holding a baby." "I would have called until someone let me out," said the man Jack. A heavy jingling of keys. "Well, that would have been me, then," said the stranger. "I would have had to let you out." He selected one large key from the key ring and said, "Follow me." The man Jack walked behind the stranger. He took his knife from his pocket. "Are you the caretaker, then?" "Am I?" "Certainly, in a manner of speaking," said the stranger. They were walking towards the gates, and the man, Jack, was certain away from the baby. But the caretaker had the keys. A knife in the dark, and that was all it would take, and then he could search for the child all through the night if he needed to. He raised the knife. "If there was a baby," said the stranger, without looking back, "it wouldn't have been here in the graveyard. Perhaps you were mistaken. It is unlikely that a child would have come in here after all. Much more likely that you heard a night bird and saw a cat, perhaps, or a fox. They declared this place an official nature reserve, 30 years ago, around the time of the last funeral. Now think carefully and tell me you are certain that it was a child you saw." The man Jack thought. The stranger unlocked the side gate. "A fox," he said. "They make the most uncommon noises, not unlike a person crying. No, your visit to this graveyard was a misstep, sir. Somewhere the child you seek awaits you, but he is not here." And he let the thought sit there in the man Jack's head for a moment before he opened the gate with a flourish. "Delighted to have made your acquaintance," he said, "and I trust that you will find everything you need out there." The man Jack stood outside the gates to the graveyard. The stranger stood inside the gate, and he locked it again and put the key away. "Where are you going?" asked the man Jack. "There are other gates than this," said the stranger. "My car is on the other side of the hill. Don't mind me. You don't even remember. You don't even have to remember this conversation." "No," said the man Jack agreeably. "I don't." He remembered wandering up the hill, and that what he had thought to be a child had turned out to be a fox, that a helpful caretaker had escorted him back out to the street. He slipped his knife into its inner sheath. "Well," he said, "good night." "A good night to you," said the stranger, whom Jack had taken for a caretaker. The man Jack set off down the hill in pursuit of the infant. Something strange seems like it was going on there. It was almost like the stranger was able to change the way the man Jack perceived that situation, almost like change his memory or change his mind. From the shadows, the stranger watched Jack until he was out of sight. Then he moved through the night, up and up to the flat place below the brow of the hill, a place dominated by an obelisk and a flat stone set into the ground, dedicated to the memory of Josiah Worthington, local brewer, politician, and later baronet, who had, almost 300 years before, bought the old cemetery and the land around it, and given it to the city in perpetuity. He had reserved for himself the best location on the hill, a natural amphitheater with a view of the whole city and beyond, and had ensured that the graveyard endured as a graveyard, for which the inhabitants of the graveyard were grateful, although never quite as grateful as Josiah Worthington Bartholomew felt they should have been. There were, all told, some 10,000 souls in the graveyard, but most of them slept deep, or took no interest in the night-to-night affairs of the place, and there were less than 300 of them up there in the amphitheater in the moonlight. The stranger reached them as silently as the fog itself, and he watched the proceedings unfold from the shadows, and he said nothing. Josiah Worthington was speaking. He said, "My dear madam, your obduracy well, can't you see how ridiculous this is?" "No," said Mrs. Owens, "I can't." She was sitting cross-legged on the ground, and the living child was sleeping in her lap. She cradled its head with her pale hands. "What Mistress Owens is trying to say, sir, begging your honour's pardon," said Mr. Owens, standing beside her, "is that she don't see it that way. She sees it as doing her duty." Mr. Owens had seen Josiah Worthington in the flesh back when they were both alive, had in fact made several pieces of fine furniture for the Worthington Manor House out near Inglesham, and was still in awe of him. "Her duty?" Josiah Worthington Bartholomew shook his head as if to dislodge a strand of cobweb. "Your duty, madam, is to the graveyard and to the commonalty of those who form this population of discarnate spirits, revenants, and such like wights, and your duty is to return the creature as soon as possible to its natural home, which is not here." "His mamma gave the boy to me," said Mrs. Owens, as if that was all that needed to be said. "My dear woman, I am not your dear woman," said Mrs. Owens, getting to her feet. "Truth to tell, I don't even see why I am even here talking to you fiddle-pated old dunderheads, when this lad is going to wake up hungry soon enough, and where am I going to find food for him in this graveyard, I should like to know?" "Which," said Caius Pompeius stiffly, "is precisely the point. What will you feed him? How can you care for him?" Mrs. Owens' eyes burned. "I can look after him," she said, "as well as his own mamma. She already gave him to me. Look, I'm holding him, aren't I? I'm touching him." "Now see reason, Betsy," said Mother Slaughter, a tiny old thing, in the huge bonnet and cape she had worn in life and had been buried wearing. "Where would he live?" "Here," said Mrs. Owens. "We could give him the freedom of the graveyard." Mother Slaughter's mouth became a tiny O. "But," she said, then she said, "But I never." "Well, why not? It ain't the first time we'd given the freedom of the graveyard to an outsider." "That is true," said Caius Pompeius, "but he wasn't alive." And with that the stranger realized that he was being drawn, like it or not, into the conversation, and, reluctantly, he stepped out of the darkness in the shadows, detaching from them like a patch of darkness. "No," he agreed, "I am not, but I take Mrs. Owen's point." Josiah Worthington said, "You do, Silas?" "I do, for good or for evil, and I firmly believe that it is for good Mrs. Owens and her husband have taken this child under their protection. It is going to take more than just a couple of good-hearted souls to raise this child. It will," said Silas, "take a graveyard." "And what of food and the rest of it?" "I can leave the graveyard and return. I can bring him food," said Silas. "That's all very well and good, you saying that." Excuse me, wrong voice. "That's all very well and good, you saying that," said Mother Slaughter. "But you comes and you goes, and nobody keeps track of you. If you went off for a week, the boy could die." "You are a wise woman," said Silas. "I see why they speak so highly of you." He couldn't push the minds of the dead as he could the living, but he could use all the tools of flattery and persuasion he possessed, for the dead are not immune to either. Then he came to a decision. "Very well. If Mr. and Mrs. Owens will be his parents, I shall be his guardian. I shall remain here, and if I need to leave, I shall ensure that someone takes my place, bringing the child food and looking after him. We can use the crypt of the chapel," he added. "But," expostulated Josiah Worthington, "but a human child, a living child? I mean, this is a graveyard, not a nursery, blast it!" "Exactly," said Silas, nodding. "A very good point, Sir Josiah. I couldn't have put it better myself, and for that reason, if for no other, it is vital that the child be raised with as little disruption as possible to the, if you'll forgive the expression, the life of the graveyard." With that, he strolled over to Mrs. Owens, and he looked down at the infant asleep in his arms. He raised an eyebrow. "Does he have a name, Mrs. Owens?" "Not that his mother told me," she said. "Well then," said Silas, "his old name won't be of much use to him now anyway. There are those out there who mean him harm. Suppose we pick a name for him, eh?" Caius Pompeius stepped over and eyed the child. "He looks a little like my proconsul Marcus. We could call him Marcus." Josiah Worthington said, "He looks more like my head gardener Stebbins. Not that I'm suggesting Stebbins as a name. The man drank like a fish." "He looks like my nephew Harry," said Mother Slaughter, and it seemed then as if the whole graveyard was about to join in, each inhabitant offering his or her own comparison between the infant and someone long forgotten, when Mrs. Owens broke in. "He looks like nobody but himself," said Mrs. Owens, firmly. "He looks like nobody." "Then nobody it is," said Silas. "Nobody Owens." It was then that, as if responding to the name, the child opened its eyes wide in wakefulness. It stared around it, taking in the faces of the dead and the mist and the moon. Then it looked at Silas. Its gaze did not flinch. It looked grave. "And what kind of a name is Nobody?" asked Mother Slaughter, scandalized. "His name." "And a good name," said Silas told her. "It will help to keep him safe." Wrong voice again. "His name, and a good name," Silas told her. "It will help to keep him safe." "I don't want trouble," said Josiah Worthington. The infant looked up at him, and then, hungry or tired, or simply missing his home, his family, his world, he screwed up his tiny face and began to cry. "Leave us," said Caius Pompeius to Mrs. Owens. "We will discuss this further without you." Well, that explains the title of this chapter. Chapter 1. How Nobody Came to the Graveyard. Here's that first chapter.